A bombshell report by the New York Times reveals the FBI opened an investigation of President Trump to see whether he had worked on behalf of Russia.
Plus, making history. The U.S. government shutdown now becomes the longest shutdown in U.S. history. What life is like now for hundreds of thousands of American workers working without pay.
Also ahead this hour, missing for nearly 3 months. You can imagine people might have given up, but this teenage girl escaped captivity, and she's now back with family.
Thank you. We are live from CNN World Headquarters in Atlanta, and we welcome our viewers here in the United States and all around the world. I'm George Howell.
I'm Natalie Allen, and CNN Newsroom starts right now. And we begin with a shocking report from the New York Times with explosive implications. The paper reports the FBI looked into whether Donald Trump, a sitting U.S. president, was working on behalf of Russia and against American interests.
The mere statement alone, it is just unprecedented. According to the Times, the FBI started the investigation because it was worried about Mr. Trump's behavior, his actions, after he fired FBI Director James Comey. The probe also triggered by Mr. Trump's own words, his public statements when he said in a TV interview that he dismissed Comey because of the Russia inquiry. To be clear, we don't know if the special counsel Robert Mueller is still pursuing that probe as part of his overall investigation into Russian collusion.
The White House was quick to respond. Press Secretary Sarah Sanders calling the story absurd and says Comey was fired for being a, quote, disgraced partisan hack.
And we're hearing from the president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who says this, quote, the fact that it goes back a year and a half and nothing came of it showed that a breach of national security means they found nothing. Again, that according to the president's attorney.
Joining me now to talk more about this is Steve Moore. He's a retired supervisory special agent at the FBI. He's got the tie on for this interview. And then we have Steve Hall, a retired CIA chief of Russia operations. Welcome to both of you. Thanks so much for talking with us. I want to start with you, Steve Hall. How big could this be? Is this a potential bombshell? They're looking at whether the president of the United States perhaps was or is a Russian intelligence asset.
Well, sure, Natalie. I mean, just by the way you correctly phrased the question, yeah, it's a very big deal. From a counterintelligence perspective, there was always a lot of questions about guys like Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort more recently. A lot of people have been in the news because of the activities that they undertook. And then, of course, they were sort of brought to judgment after investigations. But there was always a question, oftentimes raised by the White House themselves, saying, well, yeah, but was the boss involved? You know, did Donald Trump really know about what Paul Manafort was doing or what Michael Flynn might have been doing? And now from what we've learned from the reporting this evening is that the FBI was very seriously asking that question. And yeah, so that in and of itself, I think, is a big deal. Of course, I'll defer to Steve as to the details as to what the Bureau might have been up to. But yeah, for me, from a counterintelligence perspective, it's a big deal.
Yeah, the same question to you, Steve, and then we'll break it down a little more about what led to this. But just your initial thoughts when you heard about this investigation.
Well, I agree. Anytime you are investigating at any level the president for possible involvement with a foreign power, in and of itself, that's an important investigation. I think, however, that the New York Times was not real clear on how they explained what was going on. This was not a full investigation. This is what was called a preliminary inquiry, which is very limited in scope and can be opened simply on an allegation, which means it can be opened without any evidence at all, and it has to be closed if nothing's found within 6 months. So it's not a criminal investigation as people would think of an FBI investigation.
Let's talk about what led to this investigation. It was apparently the interview that Donald Trump gave NBC about why he fired James Comey. Let's listen to that now.
Regardless of recommendation, I was going to fire Comey, knowing there was no good time to do it. And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse by the Democrats for having lost an election that they should have won.
So that was one of the things. The other thing was a letter that President Trump planned to send to Comey, which he apparently didn't do. Let's go to you, Steve Moore, to explain what was it about this investigation and this letter that triggered the FBI?
What triggered the FBI, I believe, is the fact that he repeatedly wanted to get, at least on paper, some type of evidence to support the fact that Comey allegedly told him he wasn't being investigated for involvement with the Russians. And he really wanted this on paper somehow. And I can see why that would lead agents to be concerned.
And to you, Stephen Hall, could the president have unwittingly come under Russia's influence?
Well, sure. There's always a question, Natalie, as to whenever somebody is associated with, or perhaps the question is, was this person, in this case, the president of the United States, involved or cooperating with Russia, whether it was witting or unwitting. And that probably has important legal distinctions. From a counterintelligence perspective, though, which is a significantly lower bar than a legal bar, there have been a lot of, in my assessment from a counterintelligence perspective, there have been a lot of questionable activities on the part of this president. I mean, we've mentioned a couple of them in terms of, Russia, what about the 30,000 emails? I hope you find them. But if you just look at his performance, for example, in the Oval Office with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, talking about how he just got rid of Comey, that nut, that is something that every American official should know. You don't talk about that kind of dirty laundry in front of an adversarial country and its representatives, because it allows them to take advantage of you in a counterintelligence way. So legally, there's obviously a lot of thresholds and a lot of hoops that have to be jumped through before this gets much more serious. But already there are significant concerning counterintelligence patterns that I think that have emerged over these past couple of years, and now perhaps they're beginning to culminate and come together.
Yes, and the White House has already issued a statement. It's claiming partisan politics. Here we go again with Comey. Does that argument on behalf of the White House have any merit to you, Steve Moore?
Well, here's the problem with that, and I agree completely with Steve about the counterintelligence aspect of this. The president is acting unwisely in this. However, when Comey was fired, who was in charge and who could have authorized even something as small as a preliminary inquiry against Donald Trump? It would have been the acting director, Andrew McCabe, and the deputy assistant director in charge of counterintelligence, Strzok. And so what you have are two people who have been compromised. You got not compromised in the counterintelligence way, but the American people have a compromised trust in them because they were both marched out because of political biases, apparently. So the problem is you've got the fruit of the poisonous tree. People are not going to believe an investigation that is opened by those two guys after their boss got fired. And so I think it should rightly go to Mueller because he apparently doesn't have that baggage.
We will continue to watch it. It's a remarkable new development that will follow. Steve Moore and Stephen Hall, we thank you both. We appreciate your insights.
Thanks.
Sure.
Now to the partial U.S. government shutdown. It lingers on, now officially the longest shutdown in U.S. history, and for some 800,000 federal employees, it means they've been left high and dry, hurting now, for 3 weeks and counting.
The collateral damage is piling up. House Democrats have passed bill after bill to reopen the government and get people back to work. But Senate Republicans ridicule those moves as stunts and say they won't move on anything until President Trump says okay. For more, here's CNN's Caitlin Collins.
President Trump backing off his threat to declare a national emergency to fund his border wall.
What we're not looking to do right now is national emergency.
The president making that comment during an immigration roundtable at the White House after warnings that he would likely set off a firestorm of critics if he bypassed Congress to build his signature campaign promise, though Trump still maintains he can if he wants to.
I have the absolute right to do it.
Washington is in a deadlock, and the White House has started exploring ways to pay for the wall without Congress, after talks with Democrats went nowhere.
The only way you're going to stop it The only way to stop it, without question, is with a very powerful wall or steel barrier.
Despite warnings Trump could face a lengthy legal battle if he did use his emergency powers, Senator Lindsey Graham urged him to do so after their meeting, tweeting, "Democrats don't want to make a deal and will never support a border wall. Mr. President, declare a national emergency now. Build a wall now." That comment, despite Graham saying last week a national emergency was a, quote, fallback position. But not all Republicans are on board, including Senator Chuck Grassley, who said the president should not do it. "I think it might be a bad precedent." This as Vice President Mike Pence, who has led shutdown negotiations on Capitol Hill, paid a visit to the Customs and Border Protection headquarters.
I also know that we do this in the midst of a partial government shutdown. That's no doubt created anxiety for families that are gathered here today.
Making this pledge to the border agents who aren't getting paid.
This president and this administration will keep fighting to build the wall and give you the resources and reforms you need to do your job. That's my promise.
Now, while declaring a national emergency isn't completely off the table, sources close to the president say he backed off that idea because he feared the sharp backlash he would get from not only Democrats but Republicans as well, who feared that he'd be setting a dangerous precedent. Now, despite a flurry of activity over the last several weekends throughout this shutdown, right now CNN is told there are no meetings scheduled between White House officials and congressional staffers over the weekend, and they're essentially going to wait for lawmakers to get back in town. Caitlin Collins, CNN, the White House.
To get perspective on the shutdown showdown, where things stand now, let's bring in Dr. Richard Johnson. Dr. Johnson teaches U.S. politics and international relations at Lancaster University in England, joining via Skype from Lancaster, England. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Dr. Johnson, the shutdown showdown, it lingers on, but President Trump seeming to back down for now on his threat to declare a national emergency to build a border wall that he famously promised that Mexico would pay for, admitting that it could get blocked in the courts. Mr. Trump says that is still an option, but he prefers a different path. Listen.
It's the easy way out, but Congress should do this. This is too simple. It's too basic. And Congress should do this. If they can't do it, if at some point they just can't do it, this is a 15-minute meeting. If they can't do it, I will declare a national emergency. I have the absolute right to do it.
So, Richard, with both sides still clearly dug in, where do you see things going from here?
Well, look, the president probably does have the right to call a national emergency. At least he has the first mover advantage on this. Presidents since Woodrow Wilson have declared national emergencies. There was a very significant court case in 1952 against President Harry Truman when he tried to nationalize the steel industry in the midst of the Korean War. And the Supreme Court acted against the president and said he wasn't allowed to do that. But what happened in the 1970s is that Congress passed legislation, which the National Emergencies Act of 1976, which was meant to constrain the president by requiring the president to provide justification to Congress for those actions. But what it's actually turned into is it's actually made it fairly easy for presidents to provide some kind of cursory justification and then to carry on. Now, I think if President Trump does it in this case, I think he will certainly face legal action. But we have to remember that the court has been increasingly tipping in a pro-Republican direction under this president, and the Supreme Court is a majority Republican court now. So I think that, these dynamics are, I think that the president has some room to maneuver with this, and that could be concerning for people who are concerned about presidential overreach.
President Trump also now getting credit for what is officially the longest shutdown in U.S. history. And what that means in dollars and cents for some hundreds of thousands of federal workers, Richard, is that many of these people got paychecks showing $0 and 0 cents. I remember my grandmother saying, don't mess with people's money. That's what's happening here. Some of the people affected may have even voted for this president. Do you think this leaves a lasting mark in the minds of everyday working Americans, these people who are getting checks that are worthless?
I think it's very concerning, and federal workers are in a fairly weak bargaining position. Since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, federal workers haven't been allowed to go on strike. There have been incidents where federal workers have effectively gone on strike. In 1981, famously, 11,000 air traffic controllers went on strike, and President Reagan said that was illegal action. It was illegal action, and he sacked all of them. So they don't have a huge amount of leverage compared to other workers who might be in a pay dispute with their employer. And so really what they have to depend on is public opinion. And that's their safeguard, is to hope that they're able to get the American public on side to place pressure on particularly the president and also Congress to form some sort of agreement, because they don't have that ability themselves to withdraw their labor as part of some kind of strike action.
Well, this goes to my last question here. Very quickly, the Wall Street Journal reporting that the White House Office of Management and Budget is preparing for the possibility that this could go through the end of February, well past the president's upcoming State of the Union address set for January 29th. You have Democrats refusing to negotiate and Senate Republicans blocking these appropriations bills that could reopen government. Do everyday people, do they have any leverage here to push these politicians to stop the games?
Well, so there's some interesting polling that's come out this week. You find that 31% of Americans, only 31%, support shutting down the federal government for a border wall, but a majority of Republicans do, and that's a key group to watch. But that number is now 58%, so that's dropping, and I think that's the key one for the president that he's keeping his mind on. On the other hand, so far, 2/3 of Americans in that same poll said they haven't been personally affected by the shutdown. But as people stop seeing their tax rebates, they can't get their passports, they can't get their subsidized lunches for their children, food stamps and so on. As more and more programs start to run dry, I think that will not only affect the average American, but also affect Republican voters. And I think that when a majority of Republicans stop being in favor of a shutdown, then I think you could see the president having to change his mind.
Dr. Richard Johnson with Context and Perspective, thank you.
Thank you.
We're following breaking news out of France, where authorities are responding to an explosion in central Paris. Police say the blast was caused by a gas leak at a bakery Saturday morning. An official in Paris tells CNN there were victims, but so far it's unclear how many. Police are saying the explosion is not terror-related. CNN's Paris correspondent Melissa Bell joins us now from the area where this happened. It must have been a terrifying Saturday morning for people in that neighborhood, Melissa.
That's right, Natalie. I think for anyone who would have been on what is normally a pretty busy street, I'll just show you behind me the scene now. It would have been pretty terrifying stuff. You can see there at the end of the street, Natalie, the fire services who've been battling the flames of the fire that followed the explosion for the last couple of hours. It now appears to be under control. The plumes of smoke that were billowing out of there for much of the last couple of hours have now died down. But we've been hearing a lot more about precisely what happened here before that explosion took place. And what eyewitnesses say is that, in fact, the fire services were out here about an hour before the explosion took place. Here's what one eyewitness who works in a hotel just opposite the bakery in which that explosion took place had to say about what he saw.
I felt a big pressure came out of me, a black smoke. So I just have time to get down and then cover my head and cover everything. I didn't see nothing, didn't understand nothing. So I was in panic. So fortunately, I know the exit from my hotel. So even with a lot of smoke, so I could repair the exit. So I just ran. So a lot of rocks, a lot of things came off the roof, fall down the roof. So I have some shoes. So I was running. So I'm just stepping a middle of nothing. And then I was run out. So fortunately, I get out of water.
Stand by. So
it was an explosion of such force that was felt here at 9 a.m. We're being moved out of the way, I'm sorry, because the security, the emergency services continue to use this road as they make their way to and from the scene, Natalie. But as you heard from that eyewitness and that we've heard from others, the explosion, the strength of it, the force of it was such that for a fair old distance around, there were windows that were broken. People were pushed back by the sheer force of this explosion. Now, France's Interior Minister has been visiting the scene here, even as the firefighters struggled to get that fire under control. And what the Interior Minister had to say was that although there is no official toll for the time being, he expects that there will be a lot of casualties. And one of the questions is whether those firemen who'd been called out to this scene because of that gas leak were actually present and therefore injured by the time the explosion took place. It could be that they are amongst those wounded. There are a couple of hundred firefighters at this scene behind me, 100 policemen also trying to deal with the fallout from this explosion. And remember, Natalie, that this is a Saturday morning in Paris, and that means that this is another day of yellow vest protests. So, of course, the entire city was full of policemen and women trying to ensure the safety of the streets. This is an extra thing that they need to deal with this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. The protesters there, they're in Paris, and all of a sudden this happened. It must have been quite a jolt that all of a sudden the story switched to this neighborhood. But as you said, yes, people have been injured, but no reports of any deaths. Is that right, Melissa?
That's right. No reports of any deaths for the time being. And we have had no official toll. Simply an idea from the Interior Minister that he expects there to be a lot of people wounded. We don't have any figures for the time being, and we don't know how critically those who were wounded are still. So that is one of the questions that we'll be looking to have answered. For the time being, though, certainly when it comes to the cause of this explosion, that is, of course, the first thing that you wonder when you're here in Paris. Given all the terrorist attacks of the last few years, this was an accidental explosion due to a gas leak, but the force of it, really, for anyone who is in the vicinity of this fairly busy neighborhood of Paris, it would have been extremely shocking, extremely loud, and it did cause a lot of damage. Natalie.
All right, we appreciate you being there on the scene for us. Melissa Bell in Paris. Thanks, Melissa.
The shutdown showdown. Some 800,000 federal workers have now gone without pay for 3 weeks. Still ahead, how the negative impact of the government shutdown is spreading far beyond the affected workers.
Also, she was missing for nearly 3 months after her parents were killed. But now Jamie Kloss is reunited with her relatives. We'll tell you how she got away from her kidnapper.
Wisconsin, there is relief now that a girl who was missing for nearly 3 months is reunited with relatives.
Jamie Kloss's disappearance on the day her parents were murdered spurred thousands of tips and several searches, but it was the 13-year-old herself who escaped to freedom and led police to her suspected kidnapper. For the story, here's CNN's Ryan Young.
It's amazing the will of that 13-year-old girl to survive and escape.
That's the Barron County Sheriff telling the world how Jamie Kloss was found alive after she was kidnapped and her parents murdered in their Wisconsin home. 88 days since she disappeared, and almost 70 miles away, she approached a couple walking their dog.
When I first saw her, I thought, has she run away? Did somebody just dump her off here? Because she didn't have coats or gloves, and then when she told me who she was, I figured she must have left in a hurry.
That woman took Jamie to a nearby home.
Absolutely knew it was her. We've seen her picture a million times around here. She looked exactly the same as she did in her picture, a little bit thinner, I would say.
Jeannie walked in and said, "This is Jamie Kloss, and call 911. I was in absolute shock.
That 911 call led police to Jamie Kloss and led them to arrest 21-year-old Jake Patterson, charged with her kidnapping and with the murder of her parents. The authorities say there are no other suspects.
In cases like this, we often need a big break, and it was Jamie herself who gave us that break.
One of the women who helped said Jamie shared details about her captor.
She said that this person usually hides her when others are near or when he has to leave the household.
So many questions remain. How did she escape her captor? Why did Patterson target her in the first place?
We do believe Jamie was the only target. I can tell you that the subject planned his actions and took many proactive steps to hide his identity from law enforcement and the general public.
For now, the family is just glad to have her home.
It's been awesome, and we could have never done it without the community.
I was pulled over by our local sheriff. Amazing.
Kristen Kaczynskis, who called 911 to tell police that Klaus was alive, taught the suspect at a local middle school.
I don't really remember a whole lot about Jake. I had him as a middle school student in science class. Very quiet kid, smart. I didn't really keep up with him after he left Northwood.
While her aunt shared the family's relief that her niece had been finally found.
Oh, Jamie, Aunt Jen can't wait to come and give you that big hug and hold you tight, because we're not going to let you go.
Ryan Young, Barron County, Wisconsin.
The White House calls the latest New York Times reporting absurd, but there is concern given the fact the FBI launched an investigation concerned about the actions of the U.S. president, whether it was a national security risk. We'll have that story ahead.
Plus, the unintended consequences of the government shutdown. Some furloughed workers are beginning to question their career choices as they face a fourth week without pay.
Do you want Ready to Wear?
Welcome back to viewers here in the United States and all around the world. You are watching CNN Newsroom, and we thank you for it. I'm George Howell.
I'm Natalie Allen. Here are our top stories. A strong explosion at a Paris bakery has rocked the French capital. Police say Saturday's blast was caused by a gas leak. An official tells CNN there were victims, but so far it is unclear how many. Police say the explosion is not terror-related.
A Saudi woman who says she fled family abuse in her country is now on her way to Canada. Rahaf Al-Qanoun posted this photo after boarding a plane out of Bangkok on Friday. She had been stranded in Thailand for about a week and was concerned, feared being deported back to the Middle East.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Abu Dhabi. He's touring the Middle East to reassure allies that the Trump administration has a consistent foreign policy and that it is a reliable partner. His trip comes after President Trump's shock decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria set many allies on edge.
Now to the latest on the Russia probe here in the United States. The FBI wanted to know if the actions of the sitting U.S. president threatened national security.
That, according to the New York Times, this story started coming out on Friday. It reports the FBI investigated whether President Trump was working on behalf of Russia and against American interests. The newspaper says investigators were worried about Mr. Trump's behavior days after he fired FBI Director James Comey.
The White House was quick to respond, calling the allegations absurd and adding that Comey was fired because he was, quote, a disgraced partisan hack.
A bit earlier, CNN's John Berman spoke with Adam Goldman, one of the authors of the news article. He explains what touched off the investigation.
The way these things are supposed to work is we're not supposed to find out about it, okay? That the FBI investigates somebody, there's a counterintelligence investigation, maybe they suspect, an individual might be working for Russia. They investigate, they do it quietly, and it goes away, just like they did with Carter Page, years ago in New York. And so the idea is that, the FBI can do the investigation, nobody hears about it, and maybe the person isn't working for a hostile country. And, they close the case and move on. In this case, everything became public.
Yes.
So it was much more difficult for the FBI to try to do what they needed to do here. But there were a couple of things that pushed the FBI over the edge, and I think it's been lost on people, is that the obstruction and the possible obstruction related to the firing Comey, you need an object. The obstruction has to have an object, and the object was the investigation into Russia interference in 2016. That is a national security investigation.
And
and
there were two episodes. And remember how chaotic the period was following the firing of James Comey. There were two specific episodes that alarmed some of these security officials and FBI agents in the wake of that. Explain what they were.
Obviously the firing of Comey and the referencing of the Russia investigation in the president's letter laying out why Comey should be fired. The second aspect to that was I believe it was the next day, the Lester Holt interview on NBC News. He says he did it because of Russia. And, you know, the FBI is watching this, and they say, well, he's telling us why he did it. You know, he did this on behalf of Russia. And, you know, within days of that, they've opened up this, this multi-tiered investigation that has, that has a criminal aspect and a counterintelligence aspect to it.
All right. It is important to point out that it's still unclear if the special counsel is still pursuing that investigation. Now, some 800,000 federal workers, they're left in the lurch. Millions more Americans also being impacted, all because of the partial U.S. government shutdown that is now the longest shutdown in the U.S. history. After 3 weeks without pay, many of those workers, they are angry and fed up. They're demanding they be allowed to return to work for their pay.
Even people who don't work for the government are feeling the pain. The 3-day closure of a concourse at the Miami airport means people working in food and gift shops there won't get paid either. As one furloughed federal worker tells our Jessica Dean, the feeling of helplessness is demoralizing.
Daily routines like helping with homework continue at the Virginia home Joanna McClellan shares with her son and husband. But her paychecks have stopped, making life far from normal right now.
It makes you sick. It is. It's a pit in your stomach. It's worries. It's just, emotions, and, you don't know when this is all going to sort itself out.
McClellan works for the Department of Homeland Security as an analyst and has been furloughed since the government closed December 21st.
It's quite possible, even if we open this week, I don't see a paycheck before the 1st of February, and where's my rent going to come from? How am I going to pay my bills for this month?
Her story is a familiar one, as some 800,000 federal workers remain either furloughed or working without pay, not just in Washington, D.C., but in every state, like TSA employees in Portland, Oregon.
My wife is on Social Security, so I'm it for income.
So missing one paycheck will be a burden on you?
Oh, absolutely.
Coast Guard families in Ohio.
We're the only branch of the military that is not guaranteed a paycheck during these times. My husband's in there making homemade bread because it's cheaper than buying a loaf at the store.
And federal employees in Ogden, Utah.
We want to work. We want to work.
I have enough for one more mortgage payment, and I got to go to CarMax tomorrow and sell my car.
And then there are federal contractors like Lakeisha Grant Shepard, who owns a small business employing about 24 people. Many of the company's contracts are with the federal government, and currently those invoices aren't being paid.
I'm really considering, do I forfeit my salary? Because in the past, I've always sort of sacrificed the lamb, These are my employees. I've always felt an obligation to them. So I would just, bite down and bear the bullet and just cover them.
But this time, it's different. Grant Shepard is expecting her first baby in March.
I finally thought I was in a position where we were okay enough, where I could have a child. And surprise, it's truly something out of our control.
Out of their control, but impacting them deeply.
We work really hard at, DHS, CBP, TSA, all these agencies, because we want to, support our country. We're patriotic Americans, we want to make sure that our country is safe and all that. But when we're told, oh, well, you're unnecessary, just go ahead and go home, you're going to be furloughed, that's a big hit to your morale. And it, it really makes you question, why am I doing this?
Again, thanks to Jessica Dean for that reporting.
So many stories, and they're going to keep going as the government remains shut down. Democrats are gearing up for the 2020 presidential race, and several are already throwing their names in the ring. House Representative Tulsi Gabbard told CNN's Van Jones she has decided to run. Gabbard is an Iraq war veteran and serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
She joins a fairly deep pool of Democrats who are considering runs, like former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Julian Castro. He's expected to announce a presidential bid Saturday. And the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, who says that if he runs, he'll pay for his entire campaign by himself.
Here in the U.S., the family of an Arizona woman is dealing with a horrific situation. The woman has been living in a long-term care facility since 1992.
She is in a vegetative state and requires round-the-clock care, but she suddenly went into labor last month and gave birth to a baby. CNN's Sarah Seidner has more from Phoenix, Arizona.
There are stunning new details in this case. A woman in a vegetative state becomes pregnant, has a baby, and it turns out we are now hearing the 911 call from the staff at the healthcare center that we have learned through court documents she has been in for some 27 years. What we're hearing on this 911 call gives a lot of details about what the staff did or did not know when it comes to this woman and her pregnancy.
Oh, the baby's turning blue. Baby's turning blue.
What's the emergency?
Someone just had a baby. One of our patients just had a baby, and we just had no idea she was pregnant.
Okay, is the baby
We were not
out?
prepared for that. Baby's turning blue. We need someone now. Were we able to get the baby out? Is the baby breathing? Is the baby breathing? Baby's not breathing. Baby is blue.
Okay, so are they doing CPR?
Are they doing Yeah, they're doing CPR on the baby.
Okay, good. Just keep going with that. And how's the mom doing?
Mom's doing well. It looks like she's doing well.
How far along is she?
We had no idea this person was pregnant. We had no idea this patient was pregnant.
Okay, I understand. Does she know how far along she was or anything?
We have no idea. This is a complete surprise. We were not expecting this. Are you guys still doing? Because they want you guys to still do compressions. No, the baby's breathing. Oh, the baby's breathing. Oh my God! Thank God.
So you hear there a staffer at Hacienda Healthcare saying she did not know this woman was pregnant. The question is that the case for all the people that were taking care of this woman in a vegetative state who became pregnant? Obviously, she was raped, and now police are calling this a sexual assault investigation. There are a lot of questions here as to why this facility did not know that this woman was pregnant. Now, we know that the baby did survive. The mother and baby were in the hospital, and they were recovering there in the hospital after you heard that distressing 911 call. We also know that she got a woman's wellness exam back in April of 2018 and had the baby on December 29th of 2018. So she would have been pregnant at the time she got that exam if she was going to full term, which means that they must not have done any kind of pregnancy test at the time. She was likely not showing. But there is a big question as to how the staff did not realize that this woman in a vegetative state was actually pregnant, and therefore maybe she didn't get any prenatal care either. A lot of questions, and there are a lot of people who have patients that are still here at this facility, Hacienda Healthcare, who are worried about who may have done this. Was it a staffer? Was it a stranger? Was it a family member? Was it a visitor? They simply don't know, and that's what police are looking into. They have already gotten court order to get DNA samples from all the male staffers who work at the facility. Sarah Seidner, CNN, Phoenix.
Wow. We'll be right back.
Trumpfire can help it.
The head of Japan's Olympic Committee is being investigated by French judges for alleged corruption. Reports say the investigation of Tsunekazu Takeda involves a suspicious payment of about $2 million.
It occurred around the time Tokyo won its bid for the 2020 Summer Games. Takeda denies any wrongdoing. Journalist Kaori Njoji is following the story live in Tokyo. And Kaori, what is the latest we've heard from Mr. Takeda, and where do things go from here?
Well, George, Tsunekazu Takeda is under formal investigation from French authorities, which means that he could be implicated or they could drop the case. So it could either go either way still in the French legal system. We know that he is going to hold a news conference on Tuesday, next Tuesday, but he has already denied that he has done any wrongdoing or that the Japanese Olympic Committee was involved in any kind of corruption. He says that he took part in a hearing last month in France involving a probe into Lamine Diack, who was a former IOC member and is waiting a trial in France. His son is also under investigation from the French authorities. But it seems to be an extension of an investigation that started 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago in 2016, regarding payments that Japan made to a company in Singapore that had very close ties to the Diack family. The blogosphere is alight with comparisons and parallels with Carlos Ghosn, who is, of course, the head of the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi Alliance and is in jail in Japan, has been in jail for the last 7 weeks plus on financial wrongdoing, allegations of financial wrongdoing. Both of them are luminaries in the field. Mr. Takeda is as blue blood as they come. He's the second cousin to the current emperor. He's the great-grandson of a former emperor, and he has been involved in the Olympics ever since he himself was Olympian back in the 1970s. So, but regardless of the parallels between him and Carlos Ghosn, one thing is for sure. This is yet another controversy to dog the Japanese Olympic Committee. There were concerns about the negotiations with the late architect Zaha Hadid regarding the stadium. It was blowing out of control. And then there were plagiarism allegations about the mascot as well. So it's certainly casting a pall over Japan as they gear up for the preparations for the Tokyo 2020 Olympics.
And to your point, it is interesting to see these stories playing out concurrently, people drawing similarities or looking at these similarities. Kaori and Joji, thank you for the reporting.
We're going to take you to Missouri next because look at this. Hundreds of cars and trucks stranded for hours as a winter storm pummels the area, and it's moving east. Derek Van Dam joins us with more about it next.